to Peace Talks, United States and China. Thank you for joining us tonight for the first of many discussions. My name is Dr. Irene Mavrakakis, and I am co-founder of Liberty Speaks and the Christian Caucus of the Libertarian Party. And I will be moderating the discussion with Mr. Daniel Burke of the LaRouche Foundation. Hi, Daniel.
Hi. I'm very glad to be here. Good to see you too.
Thank you. We would like to welcome our speakers. The first speaker we'd like to welcome is Jorge Besada.
Okay, I'm going to bring him up. There we go. All right.
Hi, Jorge. Jorge Besada has a degree in computer science and has been a software engineer at firms like Microsoft. He has published books on economics, and some of his economics writings can be found at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Jorge is also co-founder of Liberty Speaks, a free market educational organization. His article, 2 Reasons Why Socialism Repeatedly Fails, is one of the most concise summaries of the Mises-Hayek explanation of the impossibility of socialist central planning. Nice to see you, Jorge. Thank you for participating.
Thanks for setting this up. Yeah.
Mike Termat is a candidate for the Libertarian presidential nomination. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Irene, for putting this together.
Well, Mike last year campaigned for Congress. He served as a police officer in Florida from 2010 through 2021. Mike's prior career included work with commercial banks, the White House Office of Management and Budget, and international and federal agencies. Mike has traveled in 35 countries, including extensively throughout China. He has taught economics at 3 universities and holds 2 master's degrees and a PhD in economics. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Bill Jones. William Jones is the Washington Bureau Chief for the Executive Intelligence Review and a non-resident fellow of the Changyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Hi, Bill.
How you doing, Daniel?
Oh, pretty good.
Next, we have Frank. Frank is an engineering student working in robotics and a member of the LaRouche youth movement. Welcome, Frank.
Hi, happy to be here.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Daniel.
Next, we have Nick Brana. Nick Brana is the national chair of the People's Party and an organizer with Rage Against the War Machine. He was formerly the national political outreach coordinator with Bernie 2016 and electoral manager with Our Revolution. Hi, Nick.
Hey, Irene. Hey, Daniel. Thanks so much for hosting this tonight.
Thank
you for joining us.
Next, we have Erobos, Abzu, Lamashtu. He is an economic populist, a social activist in New York City, and also the New York City organizer for the People's Party. Welcome.
You did a great job trying to pronounce it. I commend you.
Yeah,
you got a medal for that.
Okay, next we have Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a widely acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst. He is the founder and ideological leader of the Center for Political Innovation. He was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement from its early planning stages. In 2010, he was highlighted by the Cleveland Scene magazine as the communist next door after videotaping police brutality at a high school walkout. His footage resulted in victims being acquitted in juvenile court. In 2015, he was at the center of an international incident as the only American on board an Iranian Red Crescent Society medical aid ship headed for Yemen. His latest book, which has been featured in China's Global Times and on the broadcast of Kim Iverson, is called Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. Hi, Caleb.
Hey, glad to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Chris Helali. Christopher Helali is a PhD candidate in philosophy and China government scholar for the Sino-US Cultural Communication at Tongji University in Shanghai. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you so much for having me. A pleasure to be here with you all.
Thank you. Daniel?
Okay, so it's my job to tell you a little bit about the structure. And basically, we have two questions that we have composed about the question about the idea of U.S.-China relations. We are seeking common principles, like the common principle that brought us together for the Rage Against the War Machine rallies that were organized by the People's Party and the Libertarian Party and had so many different participants. We're seeking common principles, and we have to talk everything out and be quite direct with each other about our disagreements. So here's that opportunity for that. So what's going to happen is that we will have a first question will be presented by Irene, and then we will have 2 rounds on that question. The first round will be 8 minutes per team. Each team is composed of 2 people. You've been introduced to them along those lines. And they have decided among themselves how they're going to distribute the time that's available to them. They'll have 8 minutes for the first round. They will have 3 minutes for the second round. Pretty tight. So listen carefully. And then we will go to the second question, and we'll repeat the process. So we'll be trying our best to keep strict timing, and we'll come into the scene when someone is getting over their limit by 10 or 15 seconds. But we invite you guys to submit all of your comments and questions, and we may not get to them. This is not structured the way it was last time. It's not based on the questions that come in from people who are watching. Nevertheless, everyone who is participating will want to see them and want to have an opportunity to follow up with you and share their views. So thank you very much. That's what I wanted to
Thank you, Daniel.
add. You're welcome.
We're gonna go on to the first question in just a moment. We're just gonna thank the participating co-promoting organizations: Liberty Speaks, the LaRouche organization, People's Party, Center for Political Innovation, Party of Communists USA, Christian Caucus of the Libertarian Party, Rage Against the War Machine, Free and Equal Elections, the Coalition Talk Radio, and Porcupine Gear. Okay, question 1. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen stated on April 20th, "We do not seek to decouple our economy from China's. A full separation of our economies would be disastrous for both countries. It would be destabilizing for the rest of the world." White House National Security Advisor Jane Sullivan said on April 27th, "We're not cutting off trade." Chinese Premier Li Qiang said on March 13th of this year, "China and the US have each other in their economies, and both have benefited from each other's development," he said. "China and the US can and should cooperate. There is a great potential for China-US cooperation. Containing and suppressing will do no one any good." So here's the question for the panel. What, in your view, is the nature and significance of US-China economic relations in 2023, and how should they develop over the coming decades? Every group has 8 minutes. We're going to go with the Liberty team first.
All right, thanks, Daniel and Irene. And I'm going to preface this reply to this question by first saying that everything I'll be saying here, it really comes down to having had the luck of stumbling upon the Austrian School of Economics. All my answers are based on their understanding of the world: Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and so on. And something else I want to say is that what we really have are just intellectual differences. It really comes down to myths. You know, the Catholic Church at some time ran society based on certain myths. And it's not really that we have bad people, good guys or bad guys. We just have a lot of misunderstandings, and we really have to focus on the ideas that lead people to do good things or bad things instead of vilifying each other. So I want to begin with a quote from Ludwig von Mises. He writes, "If history could teach us anything, it would be that private property is inextricably linked with civilization. The continued existence of society depends upon private property. The foundation of any and every civilization, including our own, is private ownership of the means of production." So I'm going to give a little bit of history, and then at some point I'll get into China-US relationships. Now, from private property, we get the freedom to trade our private property with anyone in the world. And this inadvertently turns the entire planet into a global supercomputer where every company is motivated to innovate and to copy the innovations of competitors. For example, maybe it was a Honda engineer in Tokyo who came up with power door locks and power windows. And then the freedom of 8 billion human beings to trade their wealth with the better cars motivated and forced BMW in Germany, Chevy and Ford in the US to copy the power door locks idea. So we can see how this process of competitive knowledge discovery turns civilization into a big supercomputer. Now, just like in the Olympics, we can discover the best athletes in the world by having everyone compete. The same thing happens with freedom to trade with everyone in the entire world. Now, morals are also information that spreads thanks to economic competition. It is hardworking, tolerant, courteous people who treat everyone with respect, regardless of where they're from, race, ethnicity, and so on, that inadvertently motivates everyone else to also treat everyone with respect and thus spreading superior morals through society. As millions of Italians, Britons, Jews, and people came to the United States in just 1 or 2 generations, thanks to private property and the competition that grows from it, they developed the classic American character of wanting to be seen as equals, responsible people, and so on. Thus, freedom and the emergent competitive knowledge discovery that arises from it, it does several things. Number one, it enables the creation and spread of superior information through society. It protects us from being coerced into doing the plans of others. It civilizes us, and it's also indispensable for discovering the truth. Now, governments are coercive, competition-immune bureaucracies that get their wealth from taxes instead of having to compete and do as good as the competitors. And governments also, in the private sector, every business is constantly trying to increase the economic pie. You have sales revenue, which is a measure of how much you have produced. And you also have costs, which is a measure of how much wealth you consumed in order to produce. If you produce more than you consume, you have a profit, which just means you have increased the amount of order in society. Now, governments do not have competitive pressures. They also do not do profit and loss calculation. So they just consume way more than they produce. And eventually they can destroy all of society. Now, government regulations are information that is not subject to competition. This is why the medical sector in the United States went from consuming about 5% of the economic pie in 1960 to about 20% today, culminating in the COVID mania, tyranny, where everybody was just coerced into locking down and so on. Now, knowing that private property is that gives us the freedom to trade and all of this competitive knowledge discovery emerges from, now we can really look back at history and understand the evolution of civilization and China-US relationships. At some point, the Catholic Church in the 1500s had a coercive monopoly on what people could do. You had to live in the same place, you had to pay, indulgences to the church and so on. But Martin Luther had a different reinterpretation of Christian mythology. And he thought, well, as long as you believe in the Bible, as long as you believe in God, you can save your soul. You do not have to pay indulgences. And that helped break up the coercive monopoly power of the church. And that inadvertently led to freedom in Europe and the business culture that eventually led to capitalism, competitive knowledge discovery. And this mechanism is what allowed a business culture to suddenly make improvements and technological improvements in Europe, taking the white man to prominence. Now, by the late 1800s, the social order was getting so complex. There were a lot of differences in wealth. Some people had a lot more wealth than others. And the idea of socialist central planning began to move. This mythology began to move through people's minds very fast. People thought that it would be better if we just had the experts tell everybody else what to do, instead of having a bunch of CEOs getting rich, exploiting people. If we just had the experts tell everyone else what to do, we could just distribute the profits and everything would be great. Now, this idea spread very fast. Eventually, Karl Marx wrote these fallacies in the Communist Manifesto, and a lot of young intellectuals, they wanted to spread these ideas. And eventually, it happened in the Soviet Union. Lenin was the first person to create, to take over the government apparatus, and he tried to bring about a harsh, coercive central planning. Now, this was a big disaster. After a few years, because of no profit and loss calculation and a coercive monopoly, the economy in Russia was just awful. And he had to change. And he called it what was called the new economic policy, where Lenin allowed some private property, allowed foreign investment, and so on. And this increased competitive knowledge discovery, and suddenly people could feed themselves again. Now, so communist ideology kept spreading throughout the world. Mao Zedong fell for this, and he spread these ideas through China. Very importantly, in 1925, Deng Xiaoping was in the Soviet Union in Moscow, and he saw the new economic policy, and he felt that the new economic policy was a good idea. We could introduce some freedom and have the government manage things, and this would become the foundation of the reforms that happened after Mao Zedong died. So Mao Zedong, the Great Leap Forward, a lot of central planning, it kept China, unfortunately, desperately poor. But then after his death, Deng Xiaoping was able to bring about these changes. He introduced some privatization. He learned from other countries, South Korea, Singapore. All of these countries were using, competition and freedom. And that is really, it was great to, this great thinker, this someone who was able to think outside of the box and introduce these reforms that introduced freedom to China. And now if we fast forward to our modern days, China, because of this increasing freedom, has grown tremendously. And what we really have with the United States, just to answer the question, all we really need is just more freedom. China, unfortunately, even though it has allowed more freedom and allows foreign investment, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, but in reality, it is now a sort of like capitalism with a big welfare state, just like most of the other countries. And all we need is just freedom. The United States should end all of these sanctions and all of these trade barriers that we have, and just allow the Chinese to trade with the United States, to buy property in the United States. And now some of the bad blood happens, unfortunately, over Taiwan, and Mike will be discussing that. And that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorge. We'll go to the communist team for the next answer to the question. So I'm going to bring up Christopher and Caleb.
Hello.
Okay. Hi.
All right. So I'm going to make some opening remarks, and then I'll give an opportunity for Chris to add anything he wants to throw in. And, just because we have the same ideology, Chris and I may not necessarily have the same interpretation. I think we're pretty close, but I'm just going to make some comments, and then Chris can jump in afterwards. First of all, today is May 4th, and this is the anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. In 1970, there was a group of students who were protesting at Kent State University. They were protesting the Vietnam War and the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. And the National Guard opened fire on them. They had no weapons. And 4 students, 2 of them were protesters, 2 of them were just bystanders, were killed. And there were other people who were disabled for life in wheelchairs. There were people who lost their hands. It was a horrendous moment. And one thing I think all of us here can agree on is that moment in American history was a disaster. That event was utterly horrendous. And while all of us here have different ideologies and different perspectives and different backgrounds, we're all anti-war. And we also all believe in freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Right now, the fact that the Uhuru movement, 4 Black revolutionary activists are being charged, indicted as Russian agents, facing a possible 10 years in prison for their speech advocating peace and cooperation with Russia, opposing U.S. escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. That's something we can all be outraged about. But if you look at that moment, 1970, when this horrendous massacre happened, one thing that's worth pointing out is at the time, among, the rural folks and the working class people who live in the areas around Kent, Ohio, there was a lot of hatred for those protesters. There was a lot of feeling those protesters were unpatriotic. They were disloyal to the country. They were disrespecting the military. And there was a lot of support for the Vietnam War. But if you go to Kent, Ohio now, and I would know because I grew up near there, you won't find support for U.S. interventions and wars around the world among the population there. People in small towns like the one I grew up in, people in rural communities and working class communities throughout this country are realizing that the problems we're facing here in America are much closer to home. People need good paying jobs. People need their roads to be paved. They need water to be properly purified. They need to deal with the inflation and the rising costs of food and gasoline. And I must point out that people don't realize how bad it is sometimes. But in 27 different U.S. states, they are literally unpaving the roads. They have a machine called a reclaimer. And the reclaimer is this machine that pulls up the asphalt and it pulverizes it and replaces a paved road with a gravel or dirt road. And it doesn't take a PhD in economics to realize that if your country is going from paved roads to dirt roads, there's something really, really wrong in the economy. This is regression, and we're seeing it all across the heartland of America. Now, I am going to focus tonight in my remarks not so much on capitalism versus communism, because that's an argument that people like me and Jorge can have back and forth. You know, we can argue about the history of the 20th century and socialist economics and the Austrian school and libertarianism and Deng Xiaoping theory and Mao Zedong thought. We can argue about that all night. But I'm on here arguing as a representative of the Center for Political Innovation, focused on how we can get our country out of this economic devastation and out of the danger of a new world war, which would only make things worse overwhelmingly for the country. And right now, I look at China, a country that is historically one of the poorest countries in the world. But over the course of decade after decade since their 1949 revolution, has lifted itself up, become the second largest economy in the world, raised 800 million people out of poverty, built the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer, a state-controlled mega corporation called Huawei Technologies, makes half the steel in the world. I see an economic powerhouse, an industrial poverty alleviation, technological innovation powerhouse on the Chinese mainland. And I've got to think that Joe Biden, and to some extent Donald Trump, must be very, very stupid to think it's in the interest of the United States of America to cut itself off from this economic powerhouse, from this poverty alleviation factory. If you look at what China has achieved, why in the world would we not want to be part of it? Countries all over the world are joining the Belt and Road Initiative, benefiting from the high-speed railway that's built by the China Railway Corporation, benefiting from the great infrastructure projects that China is promoting. Why would we want to cut ourselves off from this? It would just be a foolish thing to do economically. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate trade in certain ways. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have certain protections for American industries or American workers. But this idea that China is to blame for America's economic woes is ridiculous. The reason that American workers are suffering right now so badly is because of neoliberalism. Free market economics has driven this country into poverty, has caused the good-paying industrial jobs to go overseas, has led to a situation where we in the United States have got a mountain of debt. Household debt is through the roof. The real basis of our economy, the infrastructure, the physical economy has been hollowed out. And we basically have a country that's ruled by big banks and oil monopolists that see the United States just as one outpost in a global financial empire. They see the whole world getting poorer so that they can make themselves rich, controlling the trade routes, the classic British Empire Atlanticist model that Lenin called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And I view the future of the United States not as making China our enemy, but as teaming up with China. Imagine that we hired the China Railway Corporation to team up with American companies and build high-speed railroads across the Midwest. Imagine that American scientists and American computer engineers could team up with Chinese engineers and Chinese scientists and start making cutting-edge breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and new technological innovations. That's the future. China is speeding forward. They started speeding forward in their 1949 revolution, and they really escalated after their 1978 reform and opening up. And the United States should not make the mistake of cutting itself off from this powerhouse of economics just because that's what the big monopolies that run the United States feel is in their interest, as opposed to the interest of the overall population. You want to throw anything in, Chris?
No, I would echo everything that you've said. And I would also say that it's important when looking at China and the United States. China was historically oppressed for 2 centuries by Western imperialism, by the British who forced opium. The first major drug trade and mafia was the British Empire. So when you look at how China perceives countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, and other European countries, they cannot forget. They cannot necessarily forgive what was done to China, to the Chinese people, to the millions that became addicted to the opium that was shoved down their throats, to the cantons that were created, and the concessions and everything that were torn apart from the Chinese nation. Of course, we have what the West wants, a new one, Taiwan, which is part of the Chinese homeland, but is trying to be wrenched away by the United States and its allies. So we have to understand, all of us here, that China and the United States are intimately tied economically. Any separation will be disastrous, and we must prevent a new Cold War from developing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Caleb. We're going to go next to the People's Party. So we're going to bring up Nick and Erobos. Thank you.
Hi, Irene. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for hosting this. To everybody else who's participating. So we're going to do something similar to Caleb and Chris. I'll give some comments, and then Erobos will jump in and fill in anything additional. So, as the People's Party, we are building a major new populist party that takes no money from corporations and big donors. And those two corporate parties, those establishment parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, they will tell you that China, like Russia, like Iraq, like Libya, like Syria, is our enemy, is the enemy of American working people. But I have never met someone in this country, a working person in this country, who has a personal grudge against the people of Russia, the people of China, the people of Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those are imposed upon us, in fact, by the corporate parties, the duopoly parties, the Democrats and Republicans. It's not China that outsourced American jobs, that turned the Midwest into a blighted, post-industrial, almost apocalyptic wasteland. When you look at images in the Midwest around the Great Lakes, the Rust Belt in the south of this country, that took all the steel mill jobs, the manufacturing jobs, the auto plants, and took them to China. That wasn't China itself. It was corporations that have put themselves in bed with the government, with the state, and that govern us together as a corporate state for their own narrow interests and the narrow interest of the billionaires that own those corporations. People like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. Those people. China has exemplified and is exemplifying a different model of development than the US, especially when it comes to foreign policy, domestically, but especially in foreign policy. How many wars has China started in the Western Hemisphere, in other countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe? None. How many military bases does China have around the world? I believe that it's one. Russia, I think it's a handful. The United States, 800 military bases. As Eisenhower said, every bomb dropped, every bullet manufactured is food and clothing and warmth and care and reduction of poverty taken out from the people of this country in the United States. And the proceeds from those wars, the proceeds from that militarism, the war in Ukraine now, they don't go to the people of this country. Rather, the people in this country, they pay in blood of the soldiers that we deploy to fight these endless wars. They pay in civil liberties, in the censorship, our freedom of speech that's taken from us. They pay in the authoritarian police state that is being constructed by both the Democrats and Republicans around us with every passing day, with elements like mass surveillance, everything we ever say online, siphoned up and collected at a massive data storage center in Utah, where it's no doubt analyzed by artificial intelligence, creating profiles on every single one of us. Central bank digital currencies, now which are going to be used to be able to debank people, as was done to the Canadian truckers who fought against the mandates. And of course, big tech censorship in what Glenn Greenwald called the new ruling coalition under the Biden administration between Silicon Valley, big tech, Wall Street, and the Democratic Party. And of course, the intelligence agencies. China is showing that a different model is possible. And if we in the United States are willing to learn from that and cooperate with them and the rest of the world, we can create a world of peace, cooperation, and abundance, unlike anything that has ever been possible in human history. I'll pass it off to you, Erobos. You're muted.
Erobos, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself, please? Okay. Nick, you want to continue on until he works that out?
Yeah, Erobos, just jump in when you're able to. Caleb got to this in his comments. China, 50 years ago, the end of the Second World War, was devastated, an absolutely devastated country at the end of the Second World War from, of course, its war with Japan during World War II. It went through a revolution after that, 1949. And now that country, which began in such a economically devastated place, suffered 20 million casualties in World War II, has gone in the last 70 years to a country that has elevated hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. In China itself, the greatest economic success story worldwide. Meanwhile, the US, which had 50% of global GDP at the end of the Second World War, has now degraded to the point where our lifespans are decreasing. Infant mortality is increasing. Poverty is increasing. Wages have stagnated for decades, ever since 1968, peaked. But China's doing more than that. It's also building infrastructure and aiding other countries to develop. China's model is different from our imperial hegemonic model. Ours is to go around and impose our will economically, financially, through institutions created after the Second World War by the United States and the victors, the IMF, the World Bank, and especially the petrodollar, which is now collapsing, and impose its will. Pick leaders that are corrupt to lead countries and to do whatever Western corporations want. The Chinese model is completely different, of aiding those countries by building ports, building highways. If the United States were to do that, imagine how beloved of a country we could be for much less money. And then we could finally pay the peace dividends that were promised at the end of the Cold War to everybody and invest in our own infrastructure, our own jobs, and taking care of people right here in the United States.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Erobos. Next, we'll go to the LaRouche organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. So we'll start this story from over 50 years ago, where the United States and the People's Republic of China normalized relations. And this is one of the most pivotal moments in our recent history. Although the initial relationship was mostly for mutual security against the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, it did become the defining economic relationship for both countries over the next several decades to today. And during this time, during this past 50 years, China's economy grew by an average of 9% a year. And the result of this is that 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty, and extreme poverty has been eliminated. Life expectancy has also increased by 14 years. And on the ground, China went from a country of bicycles to today where over 70% of 1.4 billion people own at least one automobile. But on the other hand, the United States experienced a period of slowing growth and then stagnation, and formerly well-paying manufacturing jobs found in smaller towns and smaller cities were shipped overseas to developing countries, especially China, which resulted in unemployment, poverty, substance abuse, and crime. And some of the coastal cities were saved for a time with a growing so-called service-based economy, led by the healthcare and the tech industries. I think nobody here will deny that the last few decades have been a period of stagnation for the living standards of Americans compared to the ones that came before. So why is there such a big difference between the experience of China and the experience of the United States? So the answer to this question can be traced back to 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard and switched to a floating exchange rate. And what this meant was that this allowed the bankers of Wall Street and in the British financial center in the city of London to freely manipulate the exchange rate of the US dollar and various international currencies. When in 1979, China and the United States officially normalized relationships, international businesses saw an opportunity to increase the value of their stocks and later their derivatives by moving their manufacturing centers to China and other developing countries and lowering their nominal cost of production. And technically this actually decreased their cost of production, but in reality actually increased the cost of production in terms of human labor hours and energy expenditures required to manufacture and ship these products to market. But this was only profitable in monetary terms due to this imbalance in currency value made possible by the floating exchange rates. And what this meant for the United States was the elimination of well-paying manufacturing jobs and the growth of an economy not built around the physical production of actual necessary goods, but the distribution and consumption of cheap imported consumer products and the rent of intellectual property rights. This era also saw an explosion in the value of the finance sector and the dollar value of financial instruments such as derivatives, which are now valued in the quadrillions of dollars invested on bets of the price of every commodity and resources, which ultimately destabilizes the cost of these products, of these inputs for producers. And this is the cause of inflation and the current crisis that we see today. Now, on the other hand, while the United States destroyed its own physical economy, China's leaders saw an opportunity to create real economic development in their country during using certain arrangements. They created conditions and put limits on international businesses that required them to operate in a manner that would benefit China and Chinese citizens in the long term. Conditions that would limit their expansion, require them to partner with local companies and teach them how to operate, also share technology with local manufacturing firms so that they can eventually learn and build the same tech themselves. And this leaves room for native Chinese industry to grow. Domestically, China also passed a law in 1993, which is similar to the Glass-Steagall law passed in 1933 in the United States. And what this law, the Glass-Steagall law, what that did was reorganize the US banking sector after the Great Depression and enforced separation of commercial loans, such as those invested in development of agricultural land, roads, railroads, manufacturing facilities, and etc., from speculative loans invested in the aforementioned bets and manipulation of commodity prices and monetary exchange rates. Chinese state-owned banks and tax policies also played a key role in offering preferential treatment in the form of lower taxes, lower interest loans to industries of national interest, such as power generation, computer science, robotics, chip manufacturing, and others. These protectionist and dirigist policies are in the same spirit of those of the American founding father and economist Alexander Hamilton and Henry C. Carey, who was the American economist under Lincoln, that allowed the United States to become the wealthiest country in the world in the first place. Policies which the US must again learn from and emulate if it desires to exit this present crisis we find ourselves in. So China is not the cause of the US economic crisis. It is on the responsibility of the US to bring itself out of this current crisis, out of the current path it has taken. The Chinese economy can be the inspiration for American leaders to revitalize the physical economy through investments in preferential treatments, just like the Chinese, into the agricultural sector, key manufacturing sectors such as machine tool production, power generation, transportation, and public infrastructure. However, this is not the limit of what could be done through US-China cooperation. For example, China has expressed its desire to aid other countries develop in the same manner it did through a project called the Belt and Road Initiative. This project is the largest and most ambitious foreign investment policy, which seeks to link the entire world's economy to the constructions of railroads, tunnels, bridges, ports, and other public infrastructure. And despite what some of you might heard of the negative news covering this project, over 150 countries, which is the majority of the world's countries, have voluntarily signed on to this project. And Chinese leaders have even expressed their desire and continuously expressed their desire for the United States to join in on the Belt and Road, so far, which has not been accepted. So what would be the possibility of US-China cooperation in repair and expanding the crumbling infrastructure of the United States? Chinese companies could be invited to teach American companies the methods and operational style which had allowed China to build more high-quality, high-speed rail than the rest of the world in less than a decade. Sorry, Irene, just checking. How are we doing on time?
You're about out, but you can finish your idea.
Okay. So.
Oh, okay. A few minutes, actually. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Chinese companies could be invited to teach American companies the methods and operational style that allowed China to build more high-quality, high-speed rail than the rest of the world in less than a decade. For example, I'm sure you've all seen videos of highways and bridges taking only days sometimes, but usually weeks in China, which would take years in the United States. And if only the American workers and engineers could learn from certain techniques of the Chinese companies. And China has also shown a willingness to renegotiate trade and investment deals with its partners to be beneficial to both parties, something they promote called win-win cooperation. So it falls on American leaders to act on behalf of the American people to negotiate beneficial trade deals that can help restore the productive industries of the United States and improve the general well-being of the American people. Many provocations in recent years from the United States has damaged this relationship, unfortunately, and there's distrust on both sides of the other. And despite this, the Chinese leadership has still extended offers to repair relations. So for the United States to do this, they must end these provocations, which include the provocation around the issue of sovereignty of Taiwan, which will be discussed in the next panel, as well as stop its sanctions on key chip manufacturing and so on. And the US and its allies should join the Belt and Road Initiative and negotiate terms that can be beneficial for all parties involved. And this would be the first step in producing a long-term peace and prosperity for the United States and the People's Republic of China, and really for the entire world.
Thank you so much. We are going to do rebuttals in the same order, and then when we go to the next question, we will have reverse order. So for the Liberty team, I'm going to bring up Mike and Jorge, and you have a total of 3 minutes to rebut the ideas presented.
Thanks, Irene. I appreciate that. It's not so much a rebuttal as much as a teasing out of certain ideas that seem to have all been lumped into the same bucket, ideas that don't belong together. It's absolutely true. I want to reinforce the idea that our economies in China and the United States are extremely important to each other. This is quickly becoming the most important trade relationship in the world, and I believe that it will continue to be so for a long, long time. And we need to allow that to flourish. Both the American government needs to get out of the way and allow American companies and American citizens to make good decisions about investing abroad and inviting Chinese capital into the United States. There is far too much fear in the United States of Chinese competition. It's absolutely misplaced, and I agree with that sentiment that was shared by the other panelists. It's 100% true. Similarly, the Chinese government needs to do a much better job of allowing American and other nations' capitalists to invest in China. The Chinese government is much more protectionist than the American government, and it's the reason why we haven't had more and better development. So we need to make headway in that regard and get much better at it. There was a lot of mention made of problems with the American economy. I I love you guys. I want us to have a good relationship between China and the United States, but I got to be honest, you're barking up the wrong tree with nothing but propaganda if you think that it behooves our arguments in terms of building a good relationship between the Chinese people and the American people on the back of some notion that there's fundamental problems with the U.S. economy. Sure, there are problems with the U.S. economy, but it is not for a lack of innovation. This is the most vibrant and innovative economy in the world, parenthetically, by far. The Chinese per capita GDP, even giving ground for purchasing power parity, is 1/3 of the United States citizenry. This is why we have such high growth rates in China, which is terrific. Not trying to run that down, but the truth of the matter is that the United States economy is absolutely going in the right direction. The reason we have so many problems in the Midwest, especially in the 80s and the 90s, and to a certain extent starting in the 70s, was because of protectionism. We protected industries that we should not have been protecting, automobiles and steel being the most obvious. And when those protections either went away explicitly or became irrelevant because the competition was too great from abroad, those industries collapsed, and communities that have been supported by protectionism disappeared. It's a real shame. So we agree on a lot, but the idea of greater protectionism is not the road to building a good relationship.
Thank you so much. The next rebuttal is going to come from the communist team.
Go ahead, Chris.
I would argue, number one, that the United States and China's relationship, as we have all stated before, is one of the most important trade relationship in the world, and probably in all of history at this point, given the amount that is exchanged between both countries. But more than that, I think that what's very important is that the U.S. economy and its innovation is also on the declining part of the spectrum here. And that's why there's so much fear-mongering right now about China's productivity, China's innovation, about China's programs like 100,000 talents and bringing people to there. Like myself, I got a free education in China, top-notch universities. And in the US, you're saddled with death. But in China, it's all free. Everybody goes, MIT equivalent, Harvard equivalent, Yale equivalent, and they have the best professors on the whole country teaching, the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of foreigners who go there getting a top-notch education. That's what the United States fears so much. It fears that China's diplomacy and China's openness to the world will eventually eclipse it. And that's already happening. Listen, the past 20 plus years, the United States has been at war. It has spent trillions of dollars. It has cost the lives of thousands of U.S. troops, never mind the millions in the wider world, especially in West Asia and North Africa, where the U.S. has been actively pursuing regime change operations. China has done the complete opposite. China has invested tremendously in its infrastructure. I mean, when I was living there in 2013, when I first arrived, I was shocked about these high-speed trains. I could go all over the country. And now, even in 2023, 10 years later, you can go to even more parts because they just keep building. They don't stop. The United States, if you take a ride on the T or the metro in New York, it's abysmal. It's like medieval almost in terms of technology. But that's what we're living with because the investment in this country and the capacities go only to the few. Like Caleb mentioned before accurately, the money is not going to the American people. It's not going to the blue-collar workers. It's not going. Unions are slowly waning and declining, even though there's been a resurgence of the labor movement. But overall, major corporations are pulling their money from rural areas. They're pulling their money. There's monopolies that are rapidly growing. I mean, just look at Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan now. After eating First Republic, they have become a monopoly of all monopolies. He has become JP Morgan 2.0 at this point. It's 100 years since that time, but we're living it again. In China, you don't have that issue. China seeks to control the overall economic situations in the country and will prosecute billionaires for corruption. The United States promotes them. The United States is slap on the wrist, and there you go. You're back to running everything. So I think what's really important to understand here is the fear-mongering over China and the U.S. aggression towards China is all because the United States recognizes its declining imperial position and recognizes that China, because of its strategic investments and because of what it's done, is going to eclipse the United States with goodwill and diplomacy rather than war and regime change.
Thank you so much. Next, we will hear from the People's Party. Thank
Erobos,
you.
if your mic is working, you can take this. No, it seems like it still isn't, unfortunately. Well, jump in if you're able to fix it. I'll say that China is establishing that the imperial model that has been used largely throughout history by dominant powers is, number one, not necessary. It doesn't have to be the way that a strong, capable, economically developed power operates. And also that it is possible to really provide and raise people out of poverty to a degree that the billionaires and oligarchs that run the United States are not doing and are not concerned with doing. And the other thing that I want to add to this conversation is the fact that we know while hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, no particular king or pope or emperor had the power to single-handedly end the world. No matter how violent or intolerant they may have been. But today, many people have the power to end the world, especially in the superpowers, the US, Russia, China, with nuclear weapons today. But soon, other existentially threatening weapons are going to be joining nuclear weapons, are joining them right now. And that is the threat of genetically engineered superviruses, weaponized biotechnology, artificial intelligence, both a suicide race, what MIT professor and machine learning expert Max Tegmark has described as a suicide race to artificial intelligence, both between corporations and between nations, because it risks that AI is being developed in a way that doesn't include safeguards and protections from it going out of control and it potentially destroying humanity. Even something that the very developers of AI, Microsoft, Bill Gates, OpenAI, admit is a possibility if you get it wrong. And that's what happens if you have runaway, unchecked conflict and competition between great powers. We don't live in times where we can afford that anymore. All of humanity is now at risk with our level of technological development. It means, on the one hand, that we can cooperate with other powers around the world. We can build a much more cooperative, prosperous, and abundant world, eliminating poverty, eliminating war, eliminating empire for all time. What an incredible transition in human history that will be. And we can be a part of that. And as an empire that is now crumbling and declining, for the United States to play that role would be historic. That's the opportunity that we have now. On the other hand, the downside and the risk is that our technological and scientific power has grown so great that we're in this period that Carl Sagan called our technological adolescence, that if we proceed with this model of great power conflict and competition and clashing, it is only a matter of time before the level of technologies and weapons that we've developed, AI, superviruses, nukes, it's only a matter of time, and the exponential number of people who have the power to end the world in those superpowers and outside, it's only a matter of time before that conflict-based system, geopolitically and domestically in countries economically, ends human life and civilization as we know it.
Thank you, Nick. We're going to go on to the LaRouche organization.
Okay,
Thank you.
Let me start out here just for a minute with regard to what Jorge said about the Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese model, more generally about the Chinese model. Deng did not simply get most of what he implemented in the reform and opening up from his experience in the Soviet Union, unless it was some study of the new economic policy under Lenin, which ended at the time of Lenin's death. But more importantly, he did really learn from the American system. Now, he didn't read, I don't know, but they probably didn't read Hamilton and Carey, but what he did is he visited Japan, he visited Singapore, he visited other countries to see how they developed. And of course, these countries, after World War II, with the support of the United States and with the support of a Hamiltonian-like system, they implemented rapid industrial policies coming out of poverty and coming out of the situation of the war. Deng went on the Shinkansen, the first high-speed rail in Japan, was very much impressed by this, but more importantly, he understood that the key to development was creating the basis for scientific progress in the nation. And while China began as a labor force for the world, the Communist Party under Deng was intensively following a policy of using whatever they got from the production on the basis of the labor and investing it in science and technology. And just over the years, this has developed to what would be called a science-driven economic development. And it's going very quickly. And it is the official policy of the government. This is something, of course, that people who knew Lyndon LaRouche was saying to the United States in the 1970s and 80s. You've got to invest in science and technology. His Strategic Defense Initiative, which was adopted by President Reagan, was an attempt to reproduce what Kennedy had done with the moon program. China has done this in spades. And this is now the official policy. And whatever you might say about the individual GDP, they have about 400 million in the middle class, intensively active in realms of science and technology. And I think at this point, they're producing probably more scientific papers per year of a very high quality than any other country of the world. And that's going to continue. For the United States, the lesson should be, why don't we go back to what we used to do in the 1960s with the moon program and compete with China on a fair level and try and do as best as we can, but not try and penalize them for doing what we have forgotten to do over these years. But that is the model that they have, and it's very impressive, and it has much to do with the science, the understanding of science and technology, and also the question of their own 5,000-year philosophy that maybe Franco mentioned.
Thank you so much. We're going to move to the next question. And Daniel will be...
I wasn't meant to be sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
You'll have
3
more
minutes.
time. Yeah, Daniel is telling me I'm not the only one timekeeping.
Right, I understand. I won't blame you.
3 minutes goes pretty quickly.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so we're going to go in reverse order. So we're actually going to pull you guys back up in a minute. So be prepared. But I'm going to go ahead and read from our second question. It includes a lengthy quote from former Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who played in a very important role in U.S.-China relations because, of course, he was the translator for Nixon, excuse me, in his trip to China. So allow me to bring that up real quick. Ambassador Chaz Freeman said the following in a recent interview. The framework that I helped work out to manage the fact that the Chinese Civil War had not ended, it was suspended by American intervention in 1950. That froze the Civil War. We worked out a framework that persuaded the Chinese, yes, it is your Civil War. Yes, we will accept a peaceful settlement of this Civil War. Inevitably, that means some kind of reunification. What sort of reunification takes place is up to you to work out with your fellow Chinese, and we won't interfere. Well, all of those things are gone. The entire framework is collapsed. We agreed no relations with Taipei. We now treat it as though we had diplomatic relations. There's a $230 million building in Taipei with a Marine Guard in it that is indistinguishable from an embassy. We agreed not to undertake to defend Taiwan. Now, we have a president who on 4 occasions has asserted that we will defend Taiwan. We said we would not have any military troops or installations on the island, and we now have both. We have created a tripwire. From the Chinese point of view, this is a betrayal of understandings that were crucial to maintaining the peace. Please respond to Ambassador Freeman's remarks. And then, the real thing we'd like to hear from you on is how can peace between the U.S. and China be guaranteed and hot war prevented? So the first thing that we're going to do, as I said, we're going to go in reverse order for these, is I'm setting my timer and we're going to bring up the team from the LaRouche movement. Let me change that ticker so it's clear what we're talking about. And we're going to have Bill and Frank once again. So hi, guys. I'm starting your time now. Go right ahead.
Okay. All right. I got my timetable here too, so I get my glasses on, make sure I stay within the limits. Let me just mention, this is a very important question because Americans just don't understand it. The Taiwan issue is probably the most important issue between the United States and China. We do not have any existential contradictions between our two nations. The Taiwan issue, to the extent that we want to move that away from what it has been over the last 30, 40 years, is the only thing that I can see that probably can create a conflict between these two major nuclear powers. Remember, after the war, we were allied with both the Communist Party and the Kuomintang. We were supporting both during the war. We had a more restrictive relationship with the CCP, but Roosevelt was intent. He knew from his own people who were there the capabilities of the Communist Party in fighting the Japanese, and so he was willing to send a military attachment there to work together and to liaise with them. The only restrictions, because of the objections of Chiang, who was our foremost collaborator there, that they could not send weapons to the Communist Party. So when there was a failure of negotiations that the U.S. was trying to mediate after the war between Chiang and Mao, when that went nowhere, the Civil War started. The United States did not get involved, but it was logistically supporting the forces of Chiang. Chiang nevertheless lost. and he lost because he had lost the support of the people. Most Americans who were involved at that time, who were involved on the ground, understood that the forces of the KMT were extremely corrupt. They were not concerned about the general population. They were restrictive of the large peasantry. They were dragooning them into military service and the like, whereas the Communist Party was very much working together with them and supportive of the peasantry during the war. And this continued during the Civil War. And of course, that's how they won the support of the people, and that was lost by Chiang. After the war, however, Americans who had been supportive of Chiang had this big debate, who lost China? And they were pointing toward those Americans in the State Department and even in the military who had been supportive and said positive things about the role of the Communist Party during the war as being those who sold out China and allowed China to be lost to the communists. This was not the case. It was a false narrative. Chiang Kai-shek lost the war, not anybody here in the United States. But even at the end of that Civil War, Chiang was transported from mainland to the island of Taiwan, where he set up an alternative regime that for many years was accepted by the United States as really the government of China, because they were not prepared to accept a communist government in China. Hostile operations continued, military operations continued from the island of Taiwan, raids on the Chinese coastal areas, bombings and similar things which were going on with the support of the United States. All of this ended with the U.S.-China agreement after the Nixon visit. And the basis of that was the acceptance by the United States that there was only one China, and that China was the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan was a part of that China. Secondly, there was the agreement on the part of the Communist Party that they would want to work towards peaceful reconciliation and would not make moves. They didn't rule out military action, but would not make moves unless there was a danger of Taiwan declaring independence. So that was the basis of establishing this tremendous relationship, which was beneficial to both parties. Believe me, the United States has benefited tremendously from the industrial development of China. And many people, I have much investment, many people who have been there, who have learned lessons from there, and who have helped with that. This has been a mutually beneficial relationship from the get-go. And by and large, that agreement of the one China policy had been in place by the U.S. administration in spite of actions continually by the U.S. Congress to try and throw a monkey wrench into that. Taiwan Relations Act was one of those which allowed the United States to continue selling weapons to Taiwan in order to maintain a defense if they were to be attacked. This has now escalated tremendously. The KMT that was ruling Taiwan for those many years also accepted a one China policy. They thought they would be able to retake China, and therefore is one China policy. That became a problem for the United States at a certain point. So they began working on other possibilities within Taiwan to create what became the Taiwan Independence Movement, or the Democratic People's Party. In 1992, there was a resolution between China and the U.S., China and Taiwan, on the agreement of accepting the idea of one country, two systems, that they would remain in the same way that they were earlier. Taiwan would maintain its own social structure, its own political structure, but would also really be a part of this one country, which was the Greater China. And this worked very well for them. A lot of Taiwanese investment in China, a lot of activity there. They benefited tremendously from this, but the U.S. continued these operations to try and undermine that policy through the creation of the so-called independence forces. So what we see as the opposition in Taiwan is really an opposition that was steered and groomed. And here in the United States, the first DPP leader was feted and groomed by the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute and these organizations. And in 2014, there was a very suspicious revolt against the KMT government of Ma Ying-jeou, which helped pave the way for the return of the DPP into power. Of course, these color revolutions have been occurring around the same time, and there's no reason why it wouldn't have occurred also in Taiwan. The attempt also now to bring Taiwan into an Indo-Pacific strategy could therefore be a red line. Nobody in China will accept Taiwanese independence, and any government that tried to push that through, I think, would be in very big trouble, because historically, socially, culturally, this is one China. This is one unit, one cultural and social unit that should be brought together. But the United States does not like that. It's like Britain during the Civil War. They'd rather see a divided China than a unified China, so they're doing everything to stop it. What the United States would have to do, if there will be good relations between the U.S. and China, or they have to back off from this playing the Taiwan card, the most dangerous card because if they do that, that could be a nuclear war. If they back off of that, I think they've got a good chance of reestablishing a relationship that has proven itself to be both beneficial to China and to the United States.
Thank you very much, Bill. Okay, now I'm going to move on to our next group. Thank you very much. So since we're going in reverse order, now we're going to hear from Nick Brana, and we're really hoping that Erobos of the People's Party will also be able to join us with these new headphones. Oops, there we go. Okay, is it possible? Say no, not working. Okay,
I'm afraid we still can't hear you, Erobos. That's too bad, even with your new mic. Well, if you figure it out between now and then or for the rebuttal, please go ahead.
Your time begins now. Go right ahead.
Thanks, Daniel. The question was responding to Ambassador Freeman's remarks on how can peace between U.S. and China be guaranteed and a hot war prevented. There's a number of different concrete ways that we can achieve that. First, U.S. aggression towards China, and it is aggression, in Taiwan is similar to the aggression and provocations that were exercised against Russia before the war in Ukraine and that pushed Russia into the war in Ukraine, as the Pope, President Lula of Brazil, and other world leaders, President Lopez Obrador of Mexico, have acknowledged. It was the United States that pushed Russia into that war by violating its basic security concerns and expanding NATO right up to its border and placing weapons and missiles on its border in striking distance of Russian cities within a few minutes. Similarly, the United States is using the same model to provoke a war with China in a last desperate effort, as so many empires do, to maintain its hegemony on the world, to maintain its dominance over China and the petrodollar and the economic institutions that are a part of American hegemony, like the IMF and the World Bank. To maintain that structure. The first thing that we can do, and most important thing, is recognize that Taiwan is a part of China, and not just rhetorically, but in word and in deed. That means stop the provocative diplomatic visits by Nancy Pelosi or members of Congress or whomever else to Taiwan immediately. The provocations towards China from the United States and the military-industrial complex here would be analogous to if China suddenly decided to ring Hawaii in military with Chinese military bases, decided to start performing provocative, aggressive military exercises and maneuvers around Hawaii, and then gave billions of dollars in weapons and military aid to finance a secessionist movement, encouraging Hawaii to break off from the American mainland. The idea that the United States would tolerate that is ludicrous. The United States would have long ago used nuclear weapons against whatever country was attempting to do that. Recognize the one China policy like almost the entire rest of the world does. Number 2, slash the military budget. In the United States, we have an $800+ billion military budget. When you incorporate other expenses on intelligence and the military, it goes over $1 trillion. $1 trillion to modernize nuclear weapons over the next decade alone. Another $113 billion spent on the war in Ukraine, which is more in and of itself. That, again, additional to the military budget. That in and of itself, that $113 billion is more than Russia's entire military budget. The US military budget is more than the next 9 countries combined, most of which are allies of the United States. Slash the military budget, cut it at least in half, put that money back into infrastructure, into education, into reducing poverty, providing good food, right here in the United States. We could abolish homelessness in the US for $20 billion. That is a government estimate. How much better used would our money be that is being given in weapons, whether to Taiwan or pumped into the black hole and the black market that is Ukraine? How much better would it be to abolish poverty and homelessness here in the United States? Next is abolish nuclear weapons. Thanks to U.S. aggression with Russia, we've now essentially eliminated and lost and withdrawn from all of the arms control treaties that we had, the meaningful nuclear arms control treaties that we had. No country or group or individual in the world should have the decision to and the power and the ability to end all of human life on this planet, along with all of the rest of the life that we share it with. Abolish nuclear weapons, negotiate even stronger treaties with both powers, draw them down, and eventually eliminate them. The same with other existentially threatening weapons. Collaborate with major powers to do that. Number 5, accept that the United States is entering a new world where it is a member of a global community and not the global hegemon and bully that is supposed to dictate terms to the entire rest of the world and siphon resources both from other countries and its own people to a tiny group of military, industrial, Wall Street billionaires and corporations, multinational corporations, which have no allegiance to the United States or any other country, and instead recognize that we are a part of that new world. Recognize that it is in the interest of the other countries of the world, especially those that have been at the butt of imperialism for centuries, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and recognize that it's also, as it's in their interest, it is in ours, because the military-industrial complex doesn't serve the people of this country. Neither does a unipolar American hegemonic world order. Rather, it liquidates our freedoms. It takes billions of dollars in public taxpayer money and devotes it to killing people abroad and the development of military technologies, as opposed to the development of technologies that can benefit human well-being, cure cancer, cure other diseases, eliminate homelessness, provide for people's education, free pre-K, free college, as is normative in so much of the developed world, especially Europe. Accept enter and embrace a multipolar world order, and the way in which that provides for both Americans and people around the world to a greater extent and in a better fashion than American imperialism that only benefits a tiny ruling class today.
Thank you very much, Nick. Exactly 8 minutes. Pretty impressive. No, but thank you very much for your remarks.
I knew it was.
Okay, we're going to bring up our communist friends. So we have Caleb and Christopher Helali, and I'm about to start your timer. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Caleb, take it away.
All right. Well, I just want to give some proper historical context to all of this, because when you're talking about China, we're talking about a 5,000-year civilization, and you have to put all of this in context. People don't understand in the United States why Taiwan is so important. Before the Chinese Communist Party came to power, you had the century of humiliation. And that was a time where China was a dirt poor country, mass poverty. There would be deaths of malnutrition all the time, mass illiteracy, mass underdevelopment. I mean, if you go and read the novels of Pearl Buck, I mean, you're describing a level of poverty that is beyond what we can imagine. I mean, we're describing a huge amount of just backwardness economically. We're talking about people that were still living in like the Middle Ages in terms of economic development. The way China was kept in that situation was by keeping it divided. The British, they waged their 2 opium wars and basically forced China to open up, and allow British multinational corporations to dominate their economy. Hong Kong was broken away from China as a result of those opium wars, turned into a British protectorate. You had in Tibet, you had a feudal kingdom run by the Dalai Lama. In many areas, you had regional warlords who did not recognize the central government, and they just kind of ruled on their own. And it was a disaster. And Japan controlled parts of China, and it was a disaster. And what the Chinese Communist Party has basically, hung its hat on is that they have created one China. They have held China together as a country, because historically, not just in China, but also in Russia and the former Soviet Union, when countries and regions in that part of the world are unified and together, that's when development happens. That's when industrialization happens. That's when educational levels are increased. But when they're divided, that's when they're weaker. And Zbigniew Brzezinski knew about this. He wrote his whole book, The Grand Chessboard, about Eurasia and how to ensure U.S. domination of Eurasia by keeping it divided. He makes that point. And this has been a big part of the war hawks and the neocons' strategy for dominating the world, has been dividing the Eurasian hemisphere, and playing different parts of the former Soviet Union and different parts of China against each other. You'll remember that for a long time, the government on Taiwan, which is the government of Chiang Kai-shek, it calls itself the Republic of China. And for many years, the U.S. had diplomatic relations not with the government in Beijing, but with the government on Taiwan. And the UN seat of China was held by the government on Taiwan. Can you imagine how humiliating that was for China, a country with over 1 billion people, to have this tiny island holding their UN seat, their seat on the UN Security Council that they won as winners of the Second World War? They were being recognized with this island of Taiwan recognized by the United States. It was just a huge disgrace and humiliation and slap in the face to China. The USA funded the Tibet Civil War. People forget about the Tibet Civil War. Over 500,000 people died because during the 1950s, the USA was airdropping Tibetan extremists who wanted to bring the Dalai Lama back to power into the mountains of Tibet, who burned healthcare clinics, who murdered literacy volunteers. It was 500,000 people died in the 1950s in the Tibet Civil War. The USA has been doing everything it can to divide China. Recently, U.S. media has been playing up, Uyghur separatism, Islamic separatism in the Uyghur regions, and that this has been a big part of U.S. foreign policy. This idea that we're going to take China apart in order to humiliate the Communist Party and make the case that they shouldn't be in power because they can't hold the country together. Now, U.S. policy, U.S. law is the same as what China wants, which is that they feel that eventually the government on Taiwan and the mainland will reunify. They'll become economically closer and closer and more tied in with each other. They'll realize it's in their interest, and gradually, one step at a time, we will see one country, two systems come to an end, and Taiwan and China be completely unified with one government. That is the understanding. And when the USA established relations with China, it was understood that that would be U.S. policy. But now we see the United States doing everything it can in the opposite direction. And the reason that the United States is doing this, it serves no other purpose than to try and provoke and insult the government on the mainland. That is the only purpose it serves. If you think that the USA cares about the people living on the island of Taiwan, ask yourself why they're doing everything possible to try and make the situation that's happening in Ukraine happen on the island of Taiwan. If you care about the people on the island of Taiwan, regardless of what you think about their nationality or whether they're part of China or not, you wouldn't want them to die. And that is what U.S. leaders are doing by piling weapons in there, by having a member of the U.S. Congress go to the island of Taiwan and compare Xi Jinping to Hitler, Nancy Pelosi's provocative visit. I mean, all of this is nothing but an effort to insult the Chinese Communist Party, to say they're not worthy to lead China because they can't deliver on having a unified country, and to provoke a situation where the Chinese Communist Party will feel that they have to maintain their credibility by militarily intervening. And that would be a disaster for the whole world, especially for the people living on the island where that military confrontation would take place. And at this point, U.S. efforts to divide China have continued. The Chinese Communist Party, by creating one China, has really carried out a policy of really lifting people out of poverty and proving that China is better when it's together economically, when people are trading with each other. I mean, look, before the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1928, the novelist Edgar Snow, he wasn't a novelist, a journalist, Edgar Snow, he was living in China, and he witnessed a horrendous famine that took place. 1928, millions and millions of people died in China due to a famine that happened. And he was there, and he saw that this famine didn't have to happen. It happened because there was no strong central government that could take food from the regions that weren't having a famine and bring it to the areas that weren't. It was happening because fields that should have been growing food for people to eat were growing opium poppies, for the British Empire and for the drug trade. And he looked at it and he said, why don't people rise up and revolt against this? And China has fought very, very hard to have a strong central government that can make sure the country starts to develop. And the USA has done everything it can to do the opposite, to divide China, to break apart different sections of China, to separate China. And that's not a good policy, because when China gets stronger, if we can do business with China and we can continue to trade with China, their success could be our success. And that's what people need to remember. A strong China is not a threat to the United States. We shouldn't be viewing these things in terms of a zero-sum game. That's the way it's being sold to us. If China does well, that means we do poorly. We should view China's success as good for us, because China doesn't want a confrontation with the United States. They would like their technological labs for Made in China 2025 to be joint technological labs with American tech companies and American corporations. They're standing there saying our success doesn't have to come at your expense. And the USA is sitting there saying, no, zero-sum game. We've got to stop you from rising, because if you continue to rise, then that cuts into us. That's the wrong way to look at things.
Thank you very much, Caleb. Okay, let's go on to our Libertarian team. Hi, guys.
Thanks very much. Look, we, as libertarians and historians and economists, we want to agree with much of what's been said here. So let me start out with that. But I do believe that it is also true, and importantly true, that there has been some really significant misdiagnosis of the problems and of the motivations. Look, it's absolutely true that the United States played a role in ending the civil war in China, and that we have not lived up to what we tacitly promised. We have not remained neutral. We have changed our minds about things. We have gone back on what in effect was our word. And it is true that this has not helped the situation. It is also true, as some of you have pointed out, that this is highly reminiscent of what happened in Ukraine. We made some promises in order to induce Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. We did not stand behind those, either in terms of protecting the people of Ukraine, nor in terms of protecting the interests of the people of Russia, in the sense that we did push the NATO boundary as close to Moscow as possible. And indeed, I believe that we did contribute to making Moscow feel that it had to move into Ukraine. Having said that, I don't think that we should be excusing war. I don't think that we should be excusing the Russian government for overrunning Ukraine. And that's not to say that I don't get it, right? But that there's a difference between understanding it and saying that that's okay. So back to Taiwan. Look, we switched to a policy of strategic ambiguity. And I believe that whenever you engage in a policy of ambiguity, you're doing no one any favors. And in this particular situation, we created an opportunity for a heck of a lot of foreign investment in Taiwan that we allowed corporations to think would be safe, would have the backing of the U.S. government. There has been now so much foreign direct investment in Taiwan, so much of which has become integrated into American product supply chains, that now any number of corporate interests in the United States feel like that we have to protect Taiwan. And let's be clear, because I want to agree with you all, but we don't need to go off the deep end here. Let's be clear: the Taiwanese economy is much more innovative and robust and healthy than that in mainland China. We do have economic interests in the Taiwan government and the Taiwan economy remaining independent. We do. That doesn't mean we should be going to war over it. Don't mishear me. I wish that we had followed policies that were profoundly different leading up to this point, including the idea of it being one China. We should not have been stating that it's one China, two China, or three Chinas. It is none of our business. We should have been in the business of saying you will settle your own problems in your own way, on your own time frame, and that we're not going to play a role in it. That would have been the appropriate policy, not this idea that we recognize that it's necessarily one nation. If it is, it is, and if it ain't, it ain't. And that should have been our policy right away, but it wasn't. And now we have painted ourselves into a corner. I do believe that the right policy for us to pursue is to demilitarize the area, especially from the United States militarization point of view. We should be backing off for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the incredible number of hundreds of billions of dollars that we could save in the long run. I do believe that we need to be cutting back the U.S. military budget across the board. So, that's important. We're all on the same page in this regard. You do need to recognize that it is highly likely that there will be a war not with the United States and China, but between China and Taiwan. Those are competing interests. They are both militarized. One wants unification. One wants no part of the style of unification that Beijing would impose. You only need to look at Hong Kong, for example, to see the difference between two systems and what happens when you merge them together. Over time, it will become one system, and that's not in the economic interests of the people of Hong Kong. It just isn't. That not to say that the United Kingdom should have prolonged the transition. Heck no. The United Kingdom probably had no business controlling Hong Kong for as long as it did. But that doesn't mean that we need to be silly and lie about the situation in Hong Kong today. So I do believe that we need to back out and let people settle their problems. The reason it's so difficult politically in the United States is not because the American people have some weird interests in suppressing China. It is a matter of fear, and those fears are stoked by American politicians. You're all right. You are all correct that we need to view this not as a zero-sum or constant-sum game. The greater the economic relationship between our nations, the better for everybody, including the United States, in every way possible. But the reason that we have not been able to pursue this is not some weird cultural animosity. It is a matter of believing, incorrectly, believing that we would be better off if we did not allow our military hegemony to be eroded. Too many people in the United States, both in terms of voters and in terms of our political leaders, believe that there is some advantage to the United States economically by maintaining and projecting this military hegemony. It's absolutely not true. But people believe this to be true, and this is the reason why it's so difficult for us to back off. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mike. Okay, so we will, there it is. We're going to go back in the same order. 3 minutes to respond, to rebut, to continue your argument, however you choose to use it. And so I'm going to bring up Bill Jones and Frank with the LaRouche movement.
Okay. I'm deferring to Frank here since I hogged the whole 3 minutes before.
Thank you, Daniel and Bill. So I wanted to approach this topic from the perspective of people living in mainland China and on Taiwan, since there is so much talk from the perspective of Americans. But I wanted to emphasize first just the connection between mainland Chinese and people living on Taiwan, because it is not merely that both these countries speak the same language. In fact, the connection is much closer, especially the cultural connection. Taiwan in the 1980s and 1990s was an absolute powerhouse in terms of culture, in terms of music, in terms of movies. And often, many mainland Chinese favorite singer or favorite movie was produced by Taiwanese companies or Taiwanese actors. And same thing goes for people of Taiwan, because the language is exactly the same. The official language of the mainland China and on Taiwan is Mandarin. And even the local dialect on Taiwan is the same as the local dialect across the strait in the Fujian province. So these countries are very closely, intricately linked. In fact, the Taiwanese economy itself is it's growing, and it's growing increasingly reliant on the mainland economy. Many will say that Taiwan's economy has stagnated. Well, the saving grace of the Taiwanese economy has been the massive growing mainland economy. And for example, many Taiwanese firms rely on factories on the mainland. So in this situation, despite what some might say in terms of cultural differences and so on, the differences between the mainland and the island of Taiwan is actually growing smaller as economic integration moves forward. And it's not just economy and movies and TV. even academic exchange, even the historians, even the students. There's many mainland students that go to university in Taiwan, and there's many Taiwanese students that go to university on the mainland. So there are many programs promoted that promote cross-strait relation, and often these students find that when they mingle with each other, they're all just they share a language, they share names, they watch the same movies, they watch the same shows, and they find there very little differences between them. In fact, there's probably more differences between provinces in mainland China than between certain mainlanders and Taiwanese people. So there is actually absolutely no rush actually from the Taiwanese or mainland to change the status quo. For example, the mainland would like to unify, but they have not set a concrete deadline for unification as per 1970s. And on the news, you often hear, oh, they're threatening to use military force. That's always been the case, and that's rhetoric. But they say, oh, we would like to unify peacefully, but we'll unify military if we have to. And that is a red line by the Chinese government that they're never going to budge from. But of course, the desire there is for peaceful unification. And on Taiwan itself, the majority of people, despite the election of the DPP, it's also for the status quo, and people are happy with the way things are. And it is not really the United States' place to decide for these two countries how this issue of national unity should be handled.
Thank you very much, Frank. Okay, so now we're going to hear from the People's Party, and I am always trying to solve technical problems, so I don't give up. Is it possible that things have been improved? You can shake your head.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
I'm so happy. Okay, moving on. Time has not started. Welcome.
Yeah, right.
All
Yes,
right,
absolutely.
The rebuttal is yours.
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, let me say thanks for inviting me to this. I really don't understand the audio input of this, so I think a lot of that was my fault. I don't have a standalone mic. It's integrated with my camera here. But what I could say from what I've heard so far, it's a lot of informative perspectives, very well knowledgeable from each side. But from what I would say is when you read the power incorporation of CSIS, these think tanks, it's the same throwback imperialist mentality, right? These people, Janet Yellen just went around the world. She was in Africa, all these different countries, speaking to them like it's the 1950s, right? Telling them what their monetary policy is going to be, telling them what sort of caps they're going to put on the oil and gas. And it's like, people want to move away from that. People want to move away into modernity. They want to build their country. China has been in Africa for 30 years. A lot of people don't know that. Right? And they went to Addis Ababa, they went to Ethiopia, and they said, you don't really have a country if you don't have roads. So let us build up your roads, your infrastructure, your airports, and we're just going to do it. We're just going to do it. Put you in debt. We're not going to send our version of the IMF over there. And so, once they did that test run in that country, other countries looked to them. Other countries on the continent of Africa looked to them and invited them. Right. So now it's I view it. I don't know how much time I have, but I'll just say it's a sort of like Anglo-imperialistic reflex, right? To smack down anybody that they see rising out, because American policy. And again, if you look at the think tank papers and Rand Corporation, the way they spelled out how they want to destroy Russia in 2019. And it's a playbook, right? And that policy becomes, it's a neocon policy, and that becomes the foreign policy. So it's not like any of this stuff is secret or unknown. The problem is, economies of China in particular, and even Brazil, they have matured and they've decided to come together and move away from the hegemon. So, you know, a lot of it is, it's backwards, a lot of it is primitive thinking, and it's not, you know, when people talk about the world in the West, they're talking about the collective West. You know, unfortunately, you have, you know, because of the satrap status of Korea and Japan and Australia, you know, I don't know what the hell they're doing. Their largest trading partner is China, and you know they're talking about getting nuclear subs and pointing them at China. It's ridiculous. Those countries are going to go into the dustbin of history. You know, people want to do business, people want to move forward, and they're going to do whatever it takes to come up out of the American hegemon. It's the dying, failing empire. You know, just like Rome, only with memes and Wi-Fi and cell phones this time. So I don't know how much time I have left. I was strumming my guitar, so I don't know what's up.
Oh, you're doing great, but that does about cover the time allotted to the People's Party. Thank you very much.
You're
Okay, before I continue, I just want to say on behalf of my good friend Frank that he misspoke when he said 2 countries, and that's all it was. Okay, so we're going to go to our friends Caleb and wait, am I backwards?
No, we're good. We're gonna go to the communists. Yes,
Yeah,
Caleb.
okay, good. The communists. Here we go.
Sorry.
Oh, no, it's good. It's good. Okay, I'm giving you guys 3 minutes. Go right ahead, and I'll fix that.
Thank you very much. I would just want to say on behalf of both of us here that first and foremost, the issue of Taiwan and Taiwan separatism is an internal affair of China, and that this issue for the entire, for most of the world community, including the United States, is meant to focus on a one China policy. Now, what they say and what they do are 2 different things. So the Americans, while they say we recognize one China policy, and this has been ongoing for decades, in practice, they don't. They are supporting, they are funding the Taiwan separatists, and like others mentioned, in particularly the libertarians, they mentioned how Taiwan somehow is more innovative, but that's not true. They're innovative simply because they have the backing of the West. Tons of Western corporations are pouring in money and wealth there and making it strategically a situation where they're trying to wrench it from the Chinese mainland. And so Taiwan, being an integral part of the Chinese state, being an integral part of the Chinese homeland for many, many centuries, now all of a sudden becomes a focal point of imperialist aggression. We cannot forget that this is part of a much larger plan. We know under the Obama administration, this pivot to the Pacific, and many of these policies that pushed the American Navy and its military structures to the Pacific in confrontation with the Chinese state. And so ultimately, you do have these flybys by naval reconnaissance planes and fighter jets. You have ship movements in the South China Sea. All of these are done as provocative acts against China. It's not like the Chinese Navy is off the coast of California or Washington or Oregon, but we are directly in the territorial waters, directly in confrontation with China, thousands of miles away from our homeland here. So ultimately, we have to recognize that this conflict is manufactured by the United States and its allies and partners, and rightly pointed out by Erobos there, rightly pointing out that Japan and South Korea serve as lackeys of U.S. imperialism in the region, and they do the bidding of the American masters, who are controlling, of course, a tremendous amount of wealth, tremendous amount of military protection, and basically using those countries as staging grounds for a possible World War III scenario. And they're pushing this. They want this. It helps the military-industrial complex. It helps their shareholders. They are making tremendous fortunes off of this saber rattling that's going on from the United States and other Western countries and regional partners of the West against China. So ultimately, Taiwan is an integral part of China. It must remain that way, and we have to do everything we can to fight against any attempt to separate Taiwan or to instigate any conflict against China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Okay, and now we'll hear from the final 3 minutes from our teams, from our friends, the Libertarian team.
Hey guys, yeah, I want to echo and thank Frank for his statements about how the Taiwanese and the Chinese are okay with just keeping things as they are. I totally agree. I think the United States should just get out of there. I do not see how the Chinese are just going to invade Taiwan if the majority of people in Taiwan do not want to keep the status quo. Now, if the United States does a lot of warmongering and all this good versus evil nonsense, and we start militarizing the area and start blaming the Chinese for everything, then now you are creating an incentive to perhaps have an invasion. But again, I feel like the United States should just get out of there. And even if the China were to invade, I mean, it would be a huge black eye in the international community, especially knowing that the Taiwanese want to keep the status quo. And again, they're just not willing to do that. And if they do reunite, again, that would be awful, but it would be just like Hong Kong. Hong Kong is now part of China. I mean, it was way better before, they had more freedom, but it would not be something to risk a world war over. Now, I want to take the last 2 minutes to say something in general, just like, I mean, we just need to have faith, to have some politicians in there that can look at all of these problems and realize that whether you are like a Christian and you believe that all human beings are made in God's image, or you're a Darwinian thinker and you realize that all human beings are just, you know, the same species, we need people who look at all these conflicts and never put the blame on anyone. For example, I myself, when I look at a Palestinian who grows up in a very distraught, militarized environment, who says all these anti-Semitic things and goes out there and stabs an Israeli, I realize that's a fellow human being. I have to look at the ideas, at the environment that led to these horrible actions. And we have to be wise enough to look at the other side. When you have some hyper-religious Jew that does something and takes the land of the Palestinian and kicks them out, well, we can't just say that the Jews, you know, are controlling everything and all this nonsense. We have to, once again, have faith that we can find people that can look at the ideas and make sense and solve all of these problems. And unfortunately, now I want to criticize a little bit. For example, someone like Mike Pompeo, he's one of these naive good versus evil ideologues that runs a lot of the United States government. And he said in his new book, the book, what is it titled? Oh, well, Never Give an Inch. For example, he mentions, the Iranian regime is a de facto terrorist organization. The Obama administration's overeducated liberals decided that they knew better and sought to cut a deal with Iran. They believed that they could transform diehard Islamists into responsible partners in peace. It was sheer madness. No, you want to talk to everyone. Whatever is going on, you have to talk to people. If you just say that people are crazy and sheer madness to even talk to others, that can only lead to world war. Now, Pompeo understandably sees the world in good versus evil. And this is what he says about Julian Assange. Villains such as Assange, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, they certainly aren't journalists. If they are foreigners, they are enemies. If they are Americans, they are traitors. These crooks claim to be honoring human rights and free expression. They are in fact serving the interests of the most evil and repressive regimes. The enemies and traitors must be punished. I pursued Assange's extradition hard as CIA director and secretary of the state. I lobbied the Ecuadorians to kick Assange out of his pathetic accommodations. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, I'm running out of time. And again, Pompeo, just good versus evil. Our guys are always the good guys. Everybody else is evil. And we have to somehow have people that do not have this mentality. He also mentions, I was right in that waterboarding worked. And the CIA men and women who were tasked with collecting intelligence operate with the highest respect for the law. Again, we have our tribalistic people, and we need better leaders.
Thank you, Jorge. We do have a final section here with an opportunity for people to give brief remarks. Take it away, Irene.
That's right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to allow each team to have 2 minutes for conclusions of their choice. And we're going to switch up the order. The People's Party will go first, then the Communists, why I say that, and I don't know. Sorry. And the Libertarians and the LaRouche organization. So we're going to go to the People's Party first. And I'm so grateful to have both of you up. And thank you so much. 2 minutes, and your time starts now.
All right. I'll say something quickly, and I'll hand it off to you, Erobos, since I've talked plenty. I want to say that in conclusion, the United States should be a willing participant in creating a new 21st century global community that is not rooted in the imperialism that has defined the past hundreds of years of international relations. We can't afford that anymore. We have the technology to destroy each other and ourselves and end life on Earth and civilization as we know it. On the other hand, if we can forge that new collaborative relationship, we can build a standard of living, provide for the people in each of our individual countries, not just the US and China, but countries around the world at a higher standard of living, and really free ourselves to pursue science, the arts, have more time with our families, liberate ourselves from meaningless work by advancing the kind of technology that isn't just used to line the pockets of Pentagon officials and members of Congress who leech off of them, but really improves the standard of living and well-being of everybody else. Automation that liberates people from drudgery as opposed to simply taking jobs. So we have this stark choice in front of us. And as the People's Party, we know exactly what we want to do. We want to be a part of a community of world nations that improves people's lives around the world, especially those of the American people here who have been for so long taken advantage of by the military-industrial complex, used to oppress and exert peoples around the world.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Nick. Thank you for holding it down as you always do. Without power, change is not possible, right? Because, we're not going to be able to structure or build anything as long as the neocons remain in the State Department, remain in the military-industrial complex, remain in the White House, so, we as people, in order to get any of this off the ground, we have to take power by any and all means, right? So electoral elections is one aspect, people's power is another aspect. And that's the only way this is going to happen, because, we're not going to, like I tell people on Twitter, we're not going to tweet, we're not going to mutual aid, we're not going to podcast our way into change, right? Like, we have to get serious, because our enemy is the establishment, the corporate state, the deep state, the permanent state, whatever you want to call them. And in order for us to get these things off the ground that we've all adumbrated, we have to take power. And that means we have to engage in a struggle, because power only respects struggle, as Frederick Douglass once said, brilliantly stated. So, yeah, for me, it's about taking power. It's about manifesting the change we need. And we've seen a version of this before, right? The 1937, the Federal Reserve Act? No, it's the 1937, it's a monetary policy. And they went after all of the finance capital predators and parasites. They made them pay their fair share, and then some, paid into the system and created the world's greatest economy in history. I mean, that sunsetted until it started to go down when Nixon got there. But, these things can be done, and they have been done before. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say for having me here.
Thank you so much. We are next going to go.
1937 Revenue Act, the Revenue Act of 1937. I remember. Thank you.
Thank you. We are next going to go to Caleb from the Center for Political Innovation and Christopher from the Party of Communist USA. And I wanted to point that out specifically. Your time has not started, because I have been referring to you as communist because you're from different organizations, and that was my best way to relay where you were from. So thank you so much, but I wanted to make sure I stressed the organizations that you represent. Your time will start now, and thank you so much.
Well, sure. I guess, this is just a short conclusion. I wanted to say this, which is that, whenever conversation about China and the question of socialism versus capitalism is discussed, I often hear this logical fallacy, which is that, they say, well, China having such great success after their market reforms, starting the reform and opening up of 1978, proves that capitalism is the answer. That's a lot like saying that, it was very cold in my house the other night, so I turned the heat on. So therefore, that proves I should light my home on fire, because more heat is always the answer, because it got better after I turned the heat on. China has a largely planned economy. They have state-run industries. They have 5-year economic plans. Even private corporations are not free to do as is simply profitable for them. They're controlled by the party and told what to do. And that, yes, there are market mechanisms in China, and China was able to adjust its socialist system and not fall into the trap of the Soviet Union, not have the downfall. They were able to adjust. They were able to bend so they didn't break. But to describe China as an example of the free market working is just an illusion. And part of the reason that China has just continued to grow continuously has been because the Chinese Communist Party has control and guides the economy to continue growing. And I do want to add that while I do admire the achievements of the Chinese Revolution, that they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. And when socialism comes to America, it's going to be completely different. We're going to develop some kind of socialism with American characteristics intended to address the problems that exist on these very shores. However, there is a new economy that's emerging around the world. You've got China, you've got Iran, you've got Venezuela, you've got Russia, you've got many countries that have broken out of this dying Western Wall Street, London financial system that is just falling apart and grinding the world into poverty and trying to provoke a war or something so they can stay on top despite their failures. Well, I would like the United States to break out of that system as well and find our own route to an economy where the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power are organized to serve public good, not simply the profits of a wealthy few. And we can trade and have good relations with countries around the world on the basis of win-win cooperation. And we can march toward that ideal of a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that the very need for a state could fade away, and we could have a society where people just kind of get to do what they feel like doing and take what they need from each according to their own ability, to each according to their need, the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world based on vast abundance. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to let each person from the team have 2 minutes, seems to be the case. So we'll let Christopher get his 2 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and well said, Caleb. And I want to emphasize that the reason why we're here and the reason why we are speaking tonight is about the ongoing escalations between the United States and China. But really, it's not between the United States and China. It's actually manufactured by the United States against China. China has always been at the negotiating table, always willing to reach out diplomatically, always with the dove. The United States always with the saber, always with the nuclear arsenal, always ready for a strike. And so I think that what we have to do, what our responsibility is, not only as citizens or people who live in the United States, but really as people who live in the world, as human beings, is to fight as much as we can, to struggle to end this new Cold War paradigm, to struggle to bring about peace and to end U.S. imperialism, to end U.S. hegemony, to bring about a new world order, a world order built on respect, on sovereignty, on self-determination, and ultimately a world order that respects other countries and their systems and does not impose on other countries our own system, which doesn't even work that well here. So I think that the ultimate patriotic thing to do is to struggle and to build and to help the farmers, the workers, the ranchers, the people who need help, to give them health care, to give them free education, to give them childcare. Isn't this all what these parties and politicians keep on talking about family values? But their family values are stuffing the pockets of the big industrialists, of the warmongers, of all of these capitalists who don't care about the average worker or the average farmer. They only care about their own self-interest, about what they can gain. I don't believe in an unregulated and some sort of a fantasy that somehow the capital system will work, because ultimately monopolization is a real trajectory in history. It always has happened, and that's why governments have had to intervene to stop monopolization. So we have a struggle, and we have a struggle to prevent a war, and we have a struggle to bring about a good, just, and lasting peace for everyone on the earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both of you. We are now going to go to the Libertarian team, and we will bring up Jorge and Mike, and we are giving each of you 2 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll go first. We do have a lot of common ground. There's no question about that. As libertarians, we believe very earnestly in the non-aggression principle, as we refer to it. This means non-aggression among citizens. We believe very strongly in non-aggression from our government, especially towards citizens. We always try to stand up for the rights of individuals, and that includes individuals' rights to make their own economic decisions. It's going to be very hard for us to find common ground with those that believe that a top-down government is a good idea, either on ethical grounds or on efficiency grounds. And I think it's probably a good idea that we just sidestep that for a moment, because I also believe that it is an inappropriate way to try to make the case for non-interventionism of the American military in Asia. We should not be intervening there. We should not be wasting so much money on projecting our military hegemony, but not because we believe that we do a bad job of picking winners and losers, which we do parenthetically, but because it's inappropriate. The argument is not that Taiwan and China should be reunified. The point is, it's none of our business, and we should allow them to make that decision. There is no good argument that says the people of Hong Kong are better off now. It just wasn't worth going to war over. We all believe that, I think. There is no argument, rationally speaking, that the people of Taiwan are going to be better off after mainland China overruns them. That's just not true. But we can all argue that it should not be American policy to get involved with a civil war. That's the libertarian way. Thanks very much.
All right, so I will just finish with a few quotes from Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, members of the Austrian school. Either mankind stumbles and catches up to their wisdom, or we're just going to self-destroy. So first I'll quote the great Ludwig von Mises. He tells us, all present-day political issues concern problems commonly called economic. All arguments advanced in contemporary discussion of social and public affairs deal with fundamental matters of economics. Everybody's mind is preoccupied with economic doctrines. Economics deals with society's fundamental problems. It concerns everyone and belongs to all. It is the main and proper study of every citizen. And now, Friedrich Hayek, okay? Lots of wisdom here. It is necessary to realize that the sources of many of the most harmful agents in this world are often not evil men, but high-minded idealists, and that in particular the foundations of totalitarian barbarism have been laid by honorable and well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring they produced. Just a lot of scholars, myths, lots of errors. Hayek again. Most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our times have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, or Stalin appealed only to the worst instincts of their people. They also appealed to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. And since I have a little bit more time, I want to quote Julian Assange. I previously mentioned how Pompeo was saying all these horrible things about Assange, and this is what a man with some real class has to say. Yes, of course, there's groupism operating and probably opportunism as well. But you know, I don't think that you can cast these people as devils at all. These are people with a range of noble and ignoble character traits. They're human beings, and they have a worldview. It really is a worldview. They exist within a particular information sphere, which I find fairly confining and self-referential, and believe some weird things. But I think that's a product of the information they receive, their upbringing, their, the networks, who they are keeping them in a particular bubble. And I don't think it's because, with some exceptions, that they are intrinsically bad human beings. So this man with this incredible class, who is being oppressed by Pompeo, still says that they're not evil, that they're a product of their environment. And we need more of that, more people to just understand the ideas, not vilify each other. And I'm so glad that we're here talking about all these things. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, both of you. We're going to next go to the LaRouche organization. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me just start out quickly. The fact that this is the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. That year, 2013, will be, I think, historically considered a turning point in the history of mankind. For the first time in 40 years, in 4 decades, we have seen the results of a successful development policy. The Western countries have not been able, over those decades, to do the things that Franklin Roosevelt insisted be done after the war, including the industrialization of Africa. That is now beginning. It now has the support of the global majority. What Fred Wills, the foreign minister of Guyana, in 1976 called for at the United Nations, a new world economic order, and the creation of International Development Bank is now going on. And it has been the emergence of China and the commitment of China to global development which has created that possibility. And our problem today, or our task today, I think, is that the United States has got to begin to understand that we are in a new world order at this point, with the development of BRICS, the SCO, the various organizations that the majority of the world is uniting against, is now pointing the direction for the future. In the West, with the G7 and these so-called liberal democracy blocs, have got to wake up to see that this is the wave of the future and is in their benefit to contribute to that through their own efforts and in developing their own economies too. So I think we can see very optimistically at the point today that we are indeed moving into a new world order. Get these Yankees to understand the better natures of themselves and to get on board a policy which is the only beneficial policy for the United States going forward.
Thank you, Bill. I think I want to end our segment with a declaration that mutually beneficial agreements between nation states are possible when they seek the well-being of their own citizens. And these are the ideas which influenced the founding fathers, from Gottfried Leibniz of Germany. And Gottfried Leibniz was himself influenced by the ideas of Confucius from China, from Mencius, who believed that human beings are fundamentally good and that we should seek to uplift the ability of every single person to do the most good they can for the world in their own ability. And if we can see the world in this way, then I believe we can create lasting peace among nations. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So
Great work, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you, co-moderator Daniel Burke of the LaRouche organization. Thank you to those watching online. Thank you to all the promoting organizations. Please look for our next event on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Have a great night. We'll see you soon.